pleasure to connect with everybody. And I was just thinking, I attended a couple of the Stuart Alexander weekends in England, 3 of them actually, a couple years back, and I was given the opportunity in the last 2 years to teach some workshops. And I do a lot of teaching here when we don't have the virus going on. And I remember the first group I met with, I have kind of a standard funny line that I like to say, and I've taught at Lilydale and other places, of course. And I would always say, did you all get the message that the slower people are to be on the front row? And of course, it was just humor, you know. But the English people, they just stared at me and they were just horrified that I would say that. And I had to work them into understanding humor, you know, from the American, or actually from my perspective. I won't blame other Americans for that either. But anyway, we may have some loose humor flying around today. Nothing is ever intended to be offensive. One thing that I like to say, and I'm sure I know a few people on the call, but I'm sure all of you are on a serious spiritual path of one form or another. Isn't it nice that we can reach out, you know, and a worldwide venue such as this one, and have discussion about, you know, common subjects. But I'd like to say to people in classes that I'm working with, or even sometimes clients, don't hesitate to ask a teacher, what is the source of their truth? Because as you know, truth has many faces these days, especially in the US. And, you know, where did they learn what they know? Was it in a book they read? Was it a workshop they taught? Was it a dream that they had? Is it their best guess? You know, we get to be a certain age that we're not really interested in somebody's best guesses anymore. We want to know what the truth is. And so I will share with you briefly my truth, since that is something I feel strongly about, advocating other people do the same. I had the good fortune at the age of 10 and a half, my mom started taking us to a spiritualist church in Tampa, Florida. It was called the Shrine of the Master. It was started in 1947 by Dorothy and Russell Flexer. They were, Dorothy was a physical medium. They were both mental mediums. And she had her training from Ethel Post Parish up in Pennsylvania. And every Monday night, Dorothy went into trance. They had a class, a mediumship class, that met every single Monday night, and the class was hosted and led by spirit teachers. And her primary teacher was Charles Davis. So at the age of 11, I was allowed to start. It was invitation only, the class was, and I was allowed to start attending the class, which was a real thrill. I ended up sitting in her classes for 33 years until she made the transition in 1996. And then we had another, she was a trumpet medium. We had another trumpet medium come to us a year later, Don Nagar from Camp Chesterfield, which is in Indiana. And he was with us for 7 years. And one of the nice things we had about the classes, we were allowed to ask questions at the beginning of the class. And the questions could be on any, pretty much any non-personal subject. When Dorothy made the transition, her husband Russell had gone to spirit in the late 70s. But when she made the transition in 96, I was chosen to be the senior minister of the church at that time. I also had another, and my primary job was with Verizon in the engineering and construction part of their business in Florida. Since then, I have stayed in touch with physical mediums and trance mediums throughout the world, and have readings on a regular basis with many of these folks. So if I have a question that comes up, then and I don't have the answer, I'll write it down. I'll save it for the next reading that I have. My interest is in always telling the truth to the best of my knowledge. And so that's what brings me to where I am today. I'm not an expert in any field. That's kind of a nice cover, but I do know a lot about physical mediumships. And this morning, actually yesterday, I was doing a little bit of research with the internet, and came across some information on different types of mediums. And it said that there are basically three types of mediums: physical mediums, trance mediums, and mental mediums. Now, most of us know about mental mediums. That's the most predominant form of mediumship, I believe, in the world today. Trance mediums are those who are able to go into trance, and spirit can use their physical body and their vocal cords to communicate with people on the earth. The primary type of mediumship that we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about today, is physical mediumship. And I wanted to read the explanation that I found. It says it involves a form of phenomena whereby external spirit entities manipulate the energies and substances of a medium in order to form physical manifestations, such as spirit bodies that can take on human form, or voice boxes where a spirit can speak directly from their world to ours. I will say to you, I'm going to talk a little bit about trumpet mediumship. That's what Dorothy was. And I have, this has been a journey for me of 58 years. And it has been an amazing experience. I had no interest in becoming a medium when I was 11 or becoming a minister. I was just thrilled to be able to talk to people who had passed into the spirit world. My counterparts were watching, Lost in Space and, the Bonanza and, traditional TV programs back in the early 60s. And here I was going down every Monday night talking to the dead. Reverend Dorothy's doorkeeper her name was Red Wing. And the first time you came to a class, she would help to, as most doorkeepers or joy guides do, they try to put you at ease. And whenever somebody new would come in, she would say, well, have you ever talked to the dead before? And, they'd say, oh, no, not at all. And then she would say, well, actually, we're not the dead ones, you all are. That's what we consider, which was a lot of fun. She was a great hostess, so to speak. But with, and basically when we first started, my spirit doctor, his name is Henry Meredith, he was the one that worked with me. In fact, in the class, it was everyone's primary spirit doctor. Doctor of philosophy, I think, is another term used in other parts of the world. And Dr. Davis would have a healing prayer, then he would have questions and answers, and then he would give us an exercise. And primarily, he could say, let's work with occupations. And so for that particular night, we would tune in to our spirit doctor and try to get occupations of spirit people in the room, and then be able to place them as to where they go, who in the room can take that individual. I would say we probably average 15 to 20 people in a class. And Dorothy was very, very careful about who was let into the class. They had to be serious about mediumship and spirit, respecting the spirit leadership of the class. I remember every now and then somebody would slip in, and very quickly they'd be slipped out. You wouldn't see them show up again, because, as I said, they needed to have a respect for what was going on. But what was nice is after you gave what you had gotten, your doctor would come in and say, yes, that information about a person, a plumber or a carpenter or an engineer, whatever, that does go to so-and-so, or no, it doesn't go to that person, it goes to somebody else. And then, so they would give us feedback, which was important. You need to know when you're not on base, because that's how you improve. And we had the classes normally lasted about an hour and a half. And I had my doctor one time in a private session. He said, would you be interested in knowing what is going on our side of life during the classes? And I said, oh, absolutely. He said what they did was they put Dorothy into a trance, a deep trance, and her body had created a lot of ectoplasm, and they drew the ectoplasm. Apparently ectoplasm is created by the pancreas. And they would draw the ectoplasm out, one group of it. There was always part of the ectoplasm that stayed inside the body. And then they would take part of the ectoplasm, and they would create a pillar next to where Dorothy was sitting. The chairs were in a U, and at the opening of the U, that's where Dorothy would sit. And then they would levitate a trumpet. She had two standard aluminum trumpets, and they would levitate a trumpet to sit on top of the pillar. Then they would take some more ectoplasm and create a vocal box that they would put inside the trumpet. And the aluminum trumpet, its purpose was to magnify sound. And then they would run two more strands of ectoplasm to Dorothy's vocal box. But essentially, he also said that they had a mask. The spirit people had a mask that they would put on in order to speak through the trumpet in the vocal box. So it's just, fascinating. It was many years. It was probably 20 years before I had heard that explanation of how it actually worked. And I've always had this a strong interest in the mechanics of things, how things worked. So we had this opportunity, and when I moved to Sarasota, which was about an hour away, and I lived there for 35 years. They had a second shrine of the Master Church, one that was started in 1949, and the Flexers were living there. That was their base of operation, and they would serve both churches. There they had a mediumship class on Thursday nights, and they had a master's class on Wednesday nights. And the master's class, it would be master teachers coming in, and some of them would be connected to the people in the class, and others would be just masters from other parts of the universe. And they would, if they were connected, say Karen's master teacher would come in, and he or she would say, Karen, do you have a question for me, or do you have a topic you'd like me to speak on? And a lot of people had that, questions. If they didn't, then the master would say, does anybody have a topic? And sometimes the masters would come in with their own subject that they wanted to speak on. The good news about the master classes is that they were recorded. The mediumship classes, the question and answer portion was recorded, but then the recorder was turned off when we were giving private messages, which is pretty standard for people's privacy. So for 20 years, we had recorded those classes. And the Sarasota group has actually produced 2 books on the teachings that came forward. And Spirit asked me 10 years ago to write 3 books. And they wanted me to write on the teachings that came through those classes, because there's only 2 other people alive today that sat in those classes, that any of them. Most of the people in the classes were in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, in that age group. And all but 3 of us are in the spirit world now. So that was a fantastic opportunity, because again, Spirit was not shy in answering questions. You know, we could ask, again, anything that was a non-personal question. Another form of, in biblical times, trumpets were made of silver. And you'll see a couple references in the Old Testament about the trumpets calling people. And again, this is a reference to that. One of the, I think, most dramatic forms of physical mediumship that I've been involved with has been materialization. Now, I know that several of you are very familiar with David Thompson and Stuart Alexander as far as materialization mediums. I've had the opportunity to sit with David in 4 different countries for over 50 times. Now, I know compared to Wendy and Victor, that's probably just, you know, a drop in the bucket. In fact, I was telling someone the other day, I'd come down to Sydney a couple of times, and one of the times I was there, they were having David's regular circle meet, and Wendy and Victor are part of that circle, and Arthur Conan Doyle came in, and he was talking to Victor about Victor's website, and he didn't introduce himself, but you know, I was the stranger to the group. Everybody else knew who it was, and so he was talking, congratulating Victor on the number of people who were, you know, participating in the website and his newsletter and all that. And I said, at the appropriate moment, I said, "Oh, excuse me, I'm not sure who you are." Well, everything stopped. And Arthur Conan Doyle says, "Are you a cheeky American?" Well, we don't use that word over here, but I've been in England enough to know that it's not a pleasant, you know, it's not a compliment that he's sending my way. I said, "No, I'm just trying to figure out who Victor is talking to." But I don't know if you remember that, Wendy, but it was several years ago. It was a lot of fun. The nice thing, we had David, my first experience with David, I had heard about him, and Dorothy could do materialization, but she did it just infrequently. She was, and you know, when the time I was living in Sarasota, I'd hear about a materialization seance down in Sarasota, but there wasn't advance notice. It was just that people showed up for a regular class and they said, "We're going to do something special." So when I heard, close friends with Gerald and Eric, 2 folks from lovely folks from northern England, and they told me, "Oh, David Thompson's going to be here for 3 weeks doing a tour, and he's going to do 7 seances." And I asked him, I said, "Please get me a seat to one of those, and I'll fly over for it." And so I did. It was, I've forgotten, something Abbott or Abbey, something Abbott, down in the southern part of England. It was in a spiritualist church, and it was amazing to experience it. In fact, I think it was Timmy, David, one of David's guides. He said, "There's somebody here from America." And I said, "Well, there were 2 of us. A friend of mine, Tim, who was from York also, and I said, well, I'm from America, and Tim said the same thing. And Timmy said, no, the first person that spoke, he said, there's a physical medium here that would like to speak to you, like to talk to you. And it turned out to be Henry Slade. And I had just barely heard of Henry Slade, but he came through and he said he was interested in seeing if we'd be interested in working with slate writing. And of course, that became a very interesting, side trip. So I was fortunately invited. Tim and I were invited to go to dinner with David and his team after the seance. And I had brought pictures of our center in Sarasota. And one thing the people did there, they built a chapel for Dorothy's mediumship. It could accommodate 30 people, 30 to 40 people. It was light proof and almost soundproof, but it was a special chapel built on their grounds. And so I brought pictures of that and said, to David, I said, I'd like to see about you coming to Sarasota, Florida. And he asked me to speak to his business manager at the time and to his circle leader, which I did. Gave him lots of pictures and said, we'd like to host David. So that was in 2007. In 2008, David came to New York. There was someone who had brought him over for somebody in the city that had lost his partner, a fellow lost his partner, and he wanted to speak to him. So while they were there, they went ahead and set up what they call a guest seance. And they had 23 people, 22 people there. And it was about an hour outside of New York City. And I was invited to come to participate in that guest seance. And there were a couple of other folks, I think, that had been in touch with David or David's team to say, they'd like to they'd like to come to Australia, they'd like to do whatever they could to be able to attend a materialization seance because they're so rare. I only know of one materialization medium in the last 20 years in America. They had some prior to that, but and this was a person that is Lakota Sioux. So anyway, I came up and I had a friend who was also a spiritualist minister and was able to get him invited to it. And it was very interesting. I won't mention any names, but there was somebody from England who he kind of cornered me before the seance started. And he said, if you're interested in bringing David to Florida, that's never going to happen. And I thought, well, that's kind of bold of you. I don't remember you being the spokesman for David. He said, physical mediumship was started with the Fox sisters in upstate New York, and that's where it's going to stay as far as spirit is concerned. I said, okay. But anyway, we had the seance. It was, to me, very, very interesting. There was Timmy at one time came out, spoke, and he said, there's somebody here who talks funny. And one woman said, well, I'm Russian. I speak Russian. And he said, you're the one. And he said, your grandfather is here. And he wants to speak to you. And so then the grandfather came through and he spoke to her in Russian, and she spoke back to him in Russian. And so when their conversation was over, Timmy said, well, some people think David's a fraud. I said, he has trouble with basic English. He doesn't know any foreign languages at all, which all you have to do is sit in one seance, and it's very, very evidential. what happens. And I assume that many people here, I know Craig has, and other Karen has, other people have sat with David when he's come over here. So anyway, after that 2008 experience, the business manager contacted me and said, well, we can come over, but it's going to cost X number of dollars per person. And it was just perfectly, honest with everybody. It was too high. And I said, we're not going to be able to do that. There's a lot of wealthy people living in Sarasota, Florida, but they're not going to come to a materialization seance. It's the working class people that do that. So apparently we just gave up the thought of being able to host David. Well, apparently in another one of David's home circles, William, who's David's primary teacher, came through and said, I don't care what we have to do. We want to go to Florida. And so they contacted me and they said, okay, why don't you make a proposal on what the cost should be? And so that's what we did. And in 2009, David and his team, the 3 others, came over to Sarasota, and we had 4 seances planned. They booked very quickly. People from all over the U.S. came. The ones that knew about it. Again, this is so rare. And in fact, we had a couple workshops planned, and I think we sold out in I think it was 18 days. We sold four times 32 spots. And so we converted, wrote over to the business manager and said, could we convert one of the workshops over to another seance? And, you have to be careful of the medium, wearing the medium out, because there is a physical strain that comes with this type of mediumship. So he was a huge success. And so we had David in Sarasota in 2010 and 11. 12 and 13, we took a break. And then in 14, we had David come to Sarasota, and I brought 10 people from Santa Fe. And because, of course, nobody in the US, except those that were associated with the Lakota Sioux man, but no one essentially knew what a materialization seance was. So in 15, we had David here in Santa Fe, and 16, 17, and 18, and in 20, we were not able to have him here last year, nor were we able to have him here this year because of the virus. But essentially what's happening there, for those that have not experienced this, they draw, and David is one of the most unusual people I've ever met in his dedication to spirit and what he does. He allows himself to be tied into a chair, and he allows himself to be gagged, and during the actual seance. I can tell you right now, Dorothy Flexer would never, ever allow herself to be gagged or tied into a chair. She would never do that. But, David was wanting to make sure that it was very clear that what was happening was legitimate, and it was not, there was not fraud of any form that could be existing. So they draw the ectoplasm out, and I think many of you know that we have 4 spiritual bodies or energetic bodies, and maybe your belief system, it says more or less. It's, whatever you want to believe. But I believe that we have 4. We have the etheric body, which is the blueprint of the physical body. And we have the emotional body and the mental body. And then we have the spiritual body. And the spiritual body is the pure energy of God. So they stand in the ectoplasm. It's like a white gauzy substance. And it coats their etheric body like iron filings would coat a magnet. And they essentially can walk around the room. We put a piece of plywood, 8x4 piece of plywood, in the center of the U And we could hear them walking on the plywood when they were in that vicinity of the room. It was, it was very evidential, very interesting. We had, and what they could do, of course, there's a lot of safety. And we would do a 30-minute lecture prior to the seance starting. And the first thing that we would say is that our priority is David's well-being and David's safety. So whenever somebody would materialize, we would say, hold hands. And everybody knew they needed to hold hands. And the protocol was, if somebody let go of your hand, you would immediately speak to the circle leader. Now, I became the circle leader, I think about 7 years ago, for David in the U.S. And if someone, again, if someone said something to me, then I would stop things and find out from the individual what was going on. The only time it happened in all those 50-some seances was an older woman let go of a hand to do something with a Kleenex. I'm not sure what it was, and William caught it. William caught it before the person next to her said anything about it. And so they were right on it, right on target. The thing about the ectoplasm and for holding hands, if somebody were to touch the ectoplasm, it would cause it to coil back into David's body, keeping in mind the end of it is always attached to the inside of his body, to the pancreas. And it would cause it to coil back, snap back into his body, and could injure him very easily. It could burn him. It could, and I've seen instances where people have been burned and scarred, and it could also kill them, a physical medium. And it's a big deal for a physical medium, a materialization medium especially, to demonstrate with a group of strangers that they don't know. And what was part of the protocol was that we would call anyone who signed up for a seance, we would call them and ask them what was their motivation, what interested them in the seance. And depending upon their answers would greatly depend on whether they would be accepted. I think there was only one case that I can remember on our end of things that we rejected somebody. They didn't have the right reason for wanting to be in the seance. To me, without being dramatic, this was a holy experience. It's very evolved spirit people that were working on their end of things. These spirit chemists, they're very, very knowledgeable to be able to do all the things that they do with the ectoplasm. And so, it was the least that we could, do. Other protocols, people had to take off their belts, they had to take off their shoes. All the pockets needed to be empty. Again, checkers were chosen, a male and a female checker. And these people would represent the group, and we'd have between 35 and 40 people in a seance between Sarasota and Santa Fe. And we would bring the checkers in first and have them just go through the whole room, look into everything to make sure there were no hidden microphones, there was no transmitters of any kind, there was no trap doors, nothing of that nature. And it would be people who David did not know. So the checkers as the circle leader, I would sit in the first chair of part of the circle, the U, and then the person working the music would be in the other first chair on the other side of the room. And then the two checkers would be right next to us, so that they would be holding our hands, and they would make sure that we weren't letting go and walking around the room and, impersonating spirit. So, David's team and spirit team and physical team, very knowledgeable and very practiced at making sure everything is in place. What was quite interesting, David wore he would on his hands. In fact, I for the Sarasota group, I needed to get a special chair, one that had flat arms, so that his arms could rest on the tops of the arms of the chair, and they'd be flat, not rounded. And then they would put cat collars around his hands and his wrists, which would come around the arm of the chair, both arms of the chair. And then they would put a tie wrap through the buckle of the cat collar and cinch it down. So there's no way that he could get out of that, vice-like grip of being tied to the chair. They would put tie wraps around his legs to the front legs of the chair. And he wore a cardigan sweater. And I would always kid him. The cardigan sweater had lots of holes in it. And they would put 5. And I would say, we're going to have a bake sale. And we're going to buy David a new sweater, And they had these real small tie wraps that were only about, probably 3 or 4 inches long. And they would put 5 of them next to the buttons on the sweater. And they would put them through the material. It was like a knitted sweater. So there was plenty of room to put something through it, through the wool, and cinch it down. And and then the gag, I'd always say that was my favorite part, was putting the gag on David. Because once the gag was on, you couldn't speak. He could only make sounds, we tried to figure out what the sounds were. And then the lights we'd pull the curtain for the cabinet. He sat in a cabinet. It was 4 feet by 4 feet. 3 sides of the cabinet, the back and the 2 sides, were made of 3/4 inch plywood. The front of the cabinet was a curtain that was on, it had rings at the top across a dowel rod, and it could be, moved, the curtain could be moved to let people in or out, and it would be brought closed when the seance started. One other thing that David did, he would bring a CD of music, and there would be probably 11 or 12 songs that he had chosen, and they were songs he was familiar with. We had May was one of his guides, and she was a slave in the South before the slaves were freed in 1865. And she said her role was to take care of the children and the spirit children. And one lady in the room said, have you ever run into a boy named, I'm just going to say Robert Smith? And she goes, no, I haven't, but let me see if I can find him. And she left. And what was interesting about May, when she walked across the carpet, she was wearing these crinoline slips, that they used to wear in, I would say the old days. When I was younger, they would wear them. And you could hear him brushing against the carpet as she walked. And about 15 minutes later, she came back in. And this was the infant son. She was I think the boy was only about 4 or 5 months old when he died. And so May brought her over to this lady's name was Sheila. First name was Sheila. And she said, go ahead and let go of your right hand and of the person next to you. And she placed the boy in her lap, and he grabbed her finger. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. It was so dramatic. And of course, the mother was so thrilled that this individual was that her son was there and was alive and all of that. Another time, there was a man and wife who came together, and when I spoke with them about the pre-seance interview, they didn't tell me anything, that had happened in their past. Well, it turned out they had a 20-year-old son who he was walking home from work one night, and a drunk driver coming down the road veered off the road onto the sidewalk and killed this boy. Well, they were hoping that he would come in, and we would tell people you can't dictate to spirit who's going to come in. They discuss it, they work this out. Everybody would love to have a loved one come in. But anyway, he did come in, and he walked over to her, and it was unusual. David would seat people according to their energy. And it was unusual for a husband and wife to be seated next to each other. A lot of times they were split up according to their energy. Well, this couple was right next to each other. And the boy came in, and he actually hugged his mom and kissed her on the cheek. And then he moved to the dad. Hello, Dad. He did the same thing with his dad. He hugged him, kissed him on the cheek. And then he said to this dad, he said, I really don't want you to do what you're planning to do. And the father said, well, I'm very determined to follow through on my plans. And so they weren't arguing, but they were debating back and forth for several minutes. Apparently, and then the father finally said, okay, I won't do it. We found out after the seance was over that he was planning to kill the man who killed his son. And, his son talked him out of it. That was very, very dramatic. And in fact, when David had his website, this man did a testimonial to that effect. One other thing that happened, William, this was in the first year in Santa Fe, and I think this was 2015 or 14. And we worked at the Shriners. They had one of their large centers where they would hold ceremonies. And it was a huge complex, 4-story building and very big in Santa Fe. And we had made arrangements to rent their theater. They had a 200-seat theater down in the center of their building. The light switch, we turned the breaker for the lights. We turned that off. That's the last thing we do to make sure there's no way a light could come on, because light damages ectoplasm and would seriously damage the medium, white light. So William came through when he did his opening comments. He said, we'd like to do something special. And tonight, would you all be interested? It would mean the loved ones can't come in because we need the energy for this special thing. We said, and people said, yes, we want to do something special. So normally, once the seance is over and they play 2 songs of music, coming out songs, and then the circle leader would say, David, are you okay? And you'd hear, oh, he's got the gag in his mouth. And then I'd have a little flashlight, small little flashlight that I'd screw back together. And I would turn it on, and I would find the light switch and turn the lights on, very dim. Well, when I heard, I put the flashlight together and shined it in the middle of the room, because normally what spirit would do is levitate David and the chair anywhere from 15 to 20 feet away from the cabinet, which was a very dramatic thing to do. So I looked around, I could not find him. He was not in the center of the circle. And so I got the guy from the Shriners, and I said, let's go turn the lights on. And We turned the lights on, we came back. David was 80 feet away at the beginning of the theater, still bound to the chair. It was dramatic. But to answer your question, you know, we've had a lot of loved ones coming in, children, parents, grandparents, close friends. Do I have time for one more, Wendy?
One more, Tom, just one
Okay.
more, and then we'll move on to questions. Yes.
I was going to say something's wrong with my clock. It can't be 50 minutes since we started this thing. My youngest daughter had gotten married, and she was married to a guy named Carl, and this is in Sarasota, and they were, of course, invited to a seance, and they came. Now, Carl grew up in Eastern Europe. He grew up in one of the Baltic countries. So they had, you know, they really had very little religion there and all of this. But his father had died 6 months earlier. He was in Panama, and he was setting up a bed and breakfast there in his retirement. So the two of them were sitting, you know, in the seance. They were at the bottom of the circle, and this man materialized, and he said, "I want to speak to my son, Carl." And he walks across the floor. You can hear him walking across the floor, and he says to Carl, "Hello, son. I'm so pleased to be here." And Carl was very emotional. And one thing they did not know, he was coming down a mountain. This bed and breakfast was going to be up near the top of a mountain. He was coming down the mountain in his truck, and he'd slid off the road. And they didn't know how long he was there before he was found. They didn't know if he suffered, if he died instantly. So he said, I passed instantly. And that was a big relief to the family. He says to my daughter, he says, "Do you have any babies yet?" And I thought, well, that's kind of an odd thing to be saying to her. And apparently, and she said no. And apparently, every time they talked on the phone, he'd ask her that question. And when they went down to visit him, you know, a couple years earlier, he asked her that when he first saw her. And I never knew that. You know, I never knew he asked that question. You know, and again, it was something so evidential because, and, you know, even I didn't know that was a common, you know, instance going back and forth. So if anyone has an opportunity to sit with David, or there's a couple of other materialization mediums in the world, I would strongly recommend to do it. It is an amazing experience.